I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My title today is Poppy Wars and Manchu Monsters. I'm going to be covering the three-part fantasy series by Rebecca Kuang, which is The Poppy War, The Dragon Republic, and then The Burning God. And at the same time, I was reading Why the West Can't Win by Fadi Lama. So I had 1,900 pages of what's called grimdark fantasy, and I can attest it is very grim and very dark. And then I was reading this work of nonfiction that also covered some history of China that was also as gruesome as history gets. In Fadi's book, he has a chapter called Free World Values that talks about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the puppet state they set up of Manchukuo. The person who was in charge of that was Nobusuke Kishi, who was the grandfather of Shinzo Abe. He got his start as the Monster of Showa, which is really the monster of Manchukuo. So the Poppy Wars, I read, was inspired by the Second Sino-Japanese War, or as it's called in China, the War Against Japanese Aggression. It starts with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the War of Resistance, first trying to unite the regional leaders against the foreign invaders, and then fighting against regional leaders who were siding with the foreign invaders using a guerrilla army. At the same time, Cynthia Chung reposted Why Shinzo Abe Was Assassinated, which I read with new eyes after learning about the grandfather's remorseless cruelty and how that formed the Kishi dynasty and also Abe's legacy. So she also mentioned that Alexander Hamilton had saved the U.S. as a sovereign nation state and influenced Liszt in Germany. So I'll be responding to that in a different episode, and in this one we'll be looking at Shinzo Abe. Let's look at this slice of West versus East and East versus East, not as empires that are battling for global domination, but as imperialism versus sovereignty, the only real battle there is. And I'll be reading this from the Substack version at thirdparadigm.substack.com, where the entire text will be posted. Exploration versus exploitation. Fadi shows that empires haven't always resulted in colonization and genocide. He describes the Chinese Empire's 15th century voyages to foreign lands. Chinese expeditions, the most famous of which are those of Admiral Zheng He between 1405 and 1433, coincide with the Portuguese occupation of Cuenca in 1405. Admiral Zheng He's fleets visited Arabia, Brunei, East Africa, India, Malay Archipelago, and Thailand, dispensing and receiving goods along the way. Europeans later visited and then colonized these nations. Chinese expeditions brought back the imperial court ambassadors and dignitaries in lieu of slaves. Chinese expeditions gifted gold and silver to foreign rulers instead of killing them to steal their gold and silver. Chinese ships were loaded with gold and silver leaving China, not opium. Chinese expeditions reflected respectful civilizational interaction between the various Asian and African civilizations. European expeditions reflected a barbarian, criminal, materialistic civilization. So this lack of exploitation wasn't because China didn't have the capacity. In a chart, Fadi shows that Zheng He had a fleet of 48 to 317 ships up to 500 feet long that together held 28,000 men. Columbus had 3, with the longest at 60 feet, and 90 men. Da Gama had 4, and Magellan had 5, and that was a century later. Holy Roman Empire. Starting with the Crusades, Fadi explains why European oppression was completely lacking in ethics and scruples, as he demonstrates the highest moral authority of the popes as representatives of God, called for murder, enslavement, and expropriation of all others. He cites Pope Urban II in 1095. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, easy for him to say, wrest that land from the wicked race, the Muslims, and subject it to yourselves. Then the papal bull of Pope Nicholas V read in 1492, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, to convert them to his and their use and profit. So, conversion had nothing to do with converting the people to the religion. Instead, it was converting their movable and immovable property into profit. This crusader supremacist ideology, as Fadi calls it, became international and U.S. law as the doctrine of discovery, a European game of finders-seekers with indigenous population, the seethers and weepers. Fadi defines the triple prongs of the crusader praxis as ideological supremacism, plunder, and genocide. Ideology comes first, which was provided by the popes. Second comes the money supplied by Venice bankers. If they supplied all the funding, they got 3/4 of the profit. For 2/3, they received half, and I have my Venice mask here just for flavor. Third comes the disposable bodies to do the slaughter, supplied by the nobility's power over populations. As Francis Leader has pointed out, the formula is the same today in the 3 autonomous regions that aren't part of any country. The Vatican gives the ideological supremacy. The bankers of Venice move to the city of London, where their money creation rules us all. And Washington, D.C. provides the military for the global occupation, all run by the same imperial cabal. Poppy wars and burning gods. Now let's look at the grimdark fantasy of Rebecca Kuang in the Poppy War. In the romance to carnage ratio, there is one kiss and he stabs her in the back at the same time. It is a triple espresso shot without a drop of cream or a breath of sweetness. It's 1,900 pages of betrayal by gods and men. The foreigners are called Hesperians, and a monotheistic religion is their cover. Their advantage is in weaponry, but their real power is in deception and civil war, playing off one regional ruler against another. They promise to back one faction, but wait until so much blood has flowed on all sides that they're barely standing, then swoop in and claim the victory for themselves. Their tactics include false flag attacks on their own, chemical gases, biological warfare, torture, famine, and slavery. I read all 3 volumes, assuming the Hesperians were European or American. It's only now that I read it was inspired by the Second Sino-Japanese War fought between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan between 1937 and 1945, following a period of war localized to Manchuria that started in 1931. It was the largest Asian war in the 20th century and has been described as the Asian Holocaust, in reference to the scale of Japanese war crimes against Chinese civilians. It is known in China as the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression. The invasion of Manchuria established Manchukuo, a puppet government where Shinzo Abe's grandfather, Nobasuke Kishi, earned his title as the Monster of Showa under Hirohito, who was given the title Emperor Showa after his death. Japanese propaganda refers to this war as a crusade. It was called an incident rather than war, so it didn't trigger international treaties of defense. All wars start by attacking words. In this book, the Dragon Republic represents the last imperial dynasty, which was the Qing, which was Manchu-led and symbolized by the dragon. So Manchuria is not peripheral, but the seat of the empire. Their descendant is kept as a figurehead, but with shackles that keep him from accessing the power of the dragon and the gods. His betrayal of Rin, the orphan warrior protagonist, and the knife in her back is a practical concession to save China from complete destruction. It is an act of love. There are complex ethical questions and times when Rin asks, are the Hesperians superior to us? Is that why they're more unified and have better weaponry? Yet every war of aggression is asymmetrical because you can only use weapons of mass destruction when you have no regard for human life. In a war of aggression, the military is paid with a clear chain of command. There are no questions of morality unless you lose, and perhaps not even then. So let's look at the morality of the winners from Fadi Lama's chapter. The Monster of Manchukuo. From 1935 until its liberation in 1945, Nobasuke Kishi was given full control over Manchukuo to increase industrial growth by any means possible. He issued a decree mandating the use of slave labor. 4 million Chinese were used as slave laborers, and 40% of them died in the process. The Fushin coal mine used 40,000 slaves and 25,000 died each year, more than half. Chinese and Korean girls were used as sex slaves or comfort women to be raped nonstop by the Japanese army in World War II, and I had known about that from a book called Comfort Woman that was a shock to me at the time. Kishi states that they were closer to dogs than humans. The same Japanese mafia that Kishi used to terrorize the workers were also his distributors for Manchukuo's state opium monopoly. Kishi was so close to the Opium King that he wrote the inscription on his tombstone. He could launder money in the millions of yen with a phone call. Over the course of 150 years, at least 100 million Chinese have been killed by the Poppy War, waged by Japan, England, and the U.S. Most horrific of all was Unit 731, the world's largest and most advanced research center for biological weapons, consisting of 150 buildings and 3 crematoria. Over 10,000 Chinese, Korean, and Russians were killed in agonizing experiments. These included inducing plague, burning with flamethrowers, blowing up with shrapnel, bombarding with X-rays, spinning in centrifuges, gassing to death, and putting in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out. Live vivisection was without anesthesia as a common practice. Frostbite was inflicted limb by limb, following by amputation down to the torso, which was then used for biological experiments. Children and babies, down to 3 days old, were used with the same clinical detachment. Victims were called logs to distance them as people. I can't even describe the surgical experiments without getting nauseous, so you will need to read those from Fadi's book yourself. There was a proving ground where victims were tied to stakes and sprayed from planes with plague or infected fleas to see how many died. The Japanese army used all of China as a field experiment, dropping cholera and typhus into water, coating airborne fibers with anthrax to keep the bacteria alive until it fell on humans. They infected cakes, food, drink, clothes, and children's candy, and distributed them. After the end of the war in 1945, all 2,000 employees of Unit 731 were given immunity from the U.S. in exchange for their germ warfare and human experimentation data. The head of Unit 731 moved to Maryland to continue his research. I suspect this was at Fort Detrick in Frederick, near my hometown, which is also where Robert Malone based his biolab. The head of the frostbite experiments went on to teach at prestigious Japanese universities and received the Order of the Rising Sun. Kishi's political party, the LDP, received millions from the CIA during the 50s and 60s. He became prime minister and spoke to the U.S. Senate in 1957, the year of my birth. Introduced by Nixon as a great leader of the free world, he spoke of his belief in the lofty principles of democracy, in the liberty and dignity of the individual. After agreeing to a security treaty with the U.S., which was unpopular with the Japanese, his brother took over as prime minister. Then his grandson, Shinzo Abe, became the longest-serving prime minister in Japan, and kingmaker after that. So Japan since World War II has been the fiefdom of the Kishi clan, built on poppies, slavery, biowarfare, and torture. The true Manchurian candidate. Kishi rose to power pulling the strings of a puppet government in Manchuria, who executed their own population to serve their parasitic host. Was his grandson a hero or a villain, a Japanese imperialist or a Western collaborator and traitor to Japan? Or are these really just two different forms of villain? From Cynthia Chung on why Shinzo Abe was assassinated. News of Abe's assassination was received around the world with an admixture of very strong emotion from both extremes. Some were horrified by his death and praised what he had done for Japan as something almost saintly. Others ecstatically celebrated his death, thinking no possible good could come from him due to his attempts to revive the dark side of Japan's imperial past and his public displays of tribute to the Japanese fascists from World War II. When the news was still fresh and the frenzy of confusion at its peak, many even blamed China for the orchestration of Abe's death, thinking they were clearly the ones to benefit from such an act. It is true that Abe had a very dangerous and destructive mission to restore Japan to its status as an imperialistic empire. He was a corrupt insider who pushed for the dangerous privatization of the Japanese government and increased the gap between the wealthy and middle-class citizens. However, it is also too simplistic to celebrate his death as an absolute triumph. As we can clearly see 7 months after Abe's assassination, Japan has not become more peaceful and ready for dialogue with its Eastern partners, but rather has become much more bellicose and stauncher in its cooperation with the increasingly war-frenzied Western demands. Japan has also greatly severed motion towards greater economic and political cooperation with Russia and China, which was still moving forward when Abe was alive. It was precisely Abe's grand vision of Japan returning to its glory days as an empire that was problematic for the League of Nations vision, For if Japan saw itself on par with other great empires, or perhaps even greater, it meant that it did not ultimately intend to bend the knee. It is not about the Western Bloc against the Eastern Bloc. It is about the ruination of all nations and the formation of one empire, or if you prefer the wording, one world government. It is not about Western democracy or liberalism or Western value systems. It is about, and has only ever been about, the reinstitution of systems of empire. This is what the First World War was about. This is what the Second World War was about. And it is what the Third World War is about. Your empire or mine? I don't know whether China and Russia are building a new empire out of bricks, or if Xi and Putin are Manchurian candidates for the WEF. Maybe Abe was killed for his Japanese imperialism, or perhaps because of his collaboration with the US. In the end, does it matter? His crusade, like all crusades, used ideology for personal power. The Kishi serpent would have bitten its own allies the moment it got a better deal. What Fadi has brought me to realize is that all empires are not the same. Some act more like federations, while other federations act more like colonizing empires. I'll end with Fadi Lama's response when I told him that I was publishing this history of that time. He writes, "It is a shame that not everybody knows about these horrendous crimes. And worse is that these criminals went on to assume leading positions in Japan and the US. Exposing these crimes is our humane duty towards the memory of the poor souls who suffered." As I stated in the book, post-World War II Japan was a Kishi fiefdom, just as Saudi Arabia is to the Saudi clan. Kishi, his brother, and his grandson were prime ministers. More importantly, at least until Abe's death, they were the power behind politics in Japan. 74-year reign at least. The Kishi family has a long trail of blood dating back to 1935. There was a powerful opposition to U.S. occupation in the 1950s. This was ruthlessly quelled. In particular, to consolidate Kishi clan rule and subservience to occupation, many crimes were committed in Japan, including death squads and culminating with the assassination of opposition leader Injiro Asanuma in 1960. Asanuma was calling for entente with China. Japanese population was greatly opposed to U.S. occupation and the shameful treaties. When President Eisenhower wanted to visit Japan in 1960, the police refused to provide security for the visit. Kishi had the Yakuza, Japanese mafia, provide security, but Eisenhower canceled the visit. Cynthia is looking solely from a Western perspective, without researching internal dynamics in Japan. Enemies of the Kishi clan in Japan can be easily counted in the millions. Note that there is no justice in Japan. Suffice to note that conviction rate exceeds 99%. Of course, the death squad crimes in the 1950s had a conviction rate of 0. Accordingly, addressing the Abe assassination requires much, much more research than what Cynthia presents. So here is what strikes me. Germany is named as the belligerent of World War II, although they were reclaiming lands that had been taken from them in World War I. We are not allowed to question the extermination of 6 million Jews or talk about what happened to ordinary Germans after the war. Japan is the other belligerent who used a false flag attack as an excuse to invade China, bringing the war to the east. Did Japan support Germany or just take advantage of the chaos for its own self-interest? Was the attack on Pearl Harbor orchestrated between FDR and a Japanese warlord familiar with false flags for their own power and against national interest. Nobusuke Kishi enslaved 4 million Chinese, killing 40%, imprisoning women to be raped daily by long lines of men. He murdered over 10,000 in the most gruesome experiments imaginable. He blanketed China with airborne and waterborne plagues, subjecting millions more to excruciating deaths. Hitler became the face of evil, whose crimes we can't question. Kishi became a leader of the free world, whose crimes we don't even know. What pieces of this puzzle are we missing? For more, here's the first one I did on Cynthia Chung and her husband Matt Arrett called GeoPuzzle Pros. And this is an interview that I did with Jeff J. Brown, who has written The Big Book on China. And I'll also connect the first one I did on Babel, another Rebecca Kuang book, in the Substack. Thank you for watching.